they call it classic blues, was a quote unquote woman's genre. But Count Basie and Joe Williams showed that the brothers could get down too. Now we have our first guest. This brother is extremely busy and important in the blues community, culture, and heritage. He's worked tirelessly in regards to not just the preservation, but the education of the people of the blues, the music of the blues, and why the
see that I'm online.
To see it, the society of the blues is the way it is. T.J. Wheeler, how are you, sir?
Hey there, Lamont. I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. What's going on, my brother?
Well, man, just digging that introduction of Big Joe Williams. Every day I have the blues. Definitely.
Yeah, that Big Joe. You know, him. Man, we can go down the list, but let's. I want to talk about you, bro.
Sure. Okay.
We can
right.
dedicate the show to these cats, but your work is not only impressive, it's extremely important. So before we get into the dialogue, I would like you to set it up and share with the people your work, what you've done, and the tenure.
Okay. Well, let's see. Just to cut to the chase as far as blues education goes, I basically did my first official blues in the school program when I just a little time after I turned 19 years old, and that was in the greater Bremerton, Washington area. And I realized that putting blues in the school programs and that education in public schools was going to be a necessity as far as really getting that outreach and the word of the blues and the message and music to the wider population of Americans, really regardless of color, that its place in public education was important, not only for its musical legacy, but the more I did it, the more I realized that this was the vehicle to also teach Black history through the oral chronicles of the blues. And then that was 19. And then I grew up in the greater Northwest area. And then more and more, I felt the need to get out of the Northwest, even though some great blues musicians and jazz musicians have come out of the Pacific Northwest in the little Navy town, Bremerton, that I grew up in. Actually, Quincy Jones lived there and were stationed there. And of course, about that same time is when Ray Charles moved to Seattle and was playing all through the Central District there and beyond, and that's where him and Quincy Jones hooked up. But regardless, and of course there was Hendrix and other people, but little known figures like that, obscure bluesmen like Jimi Hendrix. What's obscure is the people's knowledge of that Jimi Hendrix
exactly
was a blues man.
Yes, he was.
Oh yeah, and but my need, at least that I felt at that time, was I needed to get my toenails and deep into the Mississippi mud and beyond, and so I started making sojourns down to the South. That was basically started when I was about 20. I turned 21 in New Orleans at the 1973 Jazz and Blues Heritage Festival in New Orleans, and where I was able to hang out and meet people like Robert P. Williams, Booker White, who invited me to come to Memphis and hang out with them there. And also a street performer named Babe Stovall. I had arrived in New Orleans about a few weeks before the festival, so I got to hang out with Babes a little bit and even play with him a little bit in Jackson Square while he was busking. And so that was the seeds of some of my motivation. And then actually it was in the Denver Folklore Center shortly after I had taken off out of Seattle, where I met Furry Lewis, who was, talk about symmetry. I arrived in Denver basically flat broke, and I got off the bus and asked the first person I saw that I thought might have the right answer if there was any kind of like cultural folklore music center in Denver. And as it was only about 2.5 blocks away from the bus station.
Wow.
And one of the first things I saw in the window was a poster that Furry Lewis was going to be playing there in 3 days.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and of course, he was one of the, he was definitely one of the top people I wanted to meet and learn from. And after the concert, we talked briefly. I could just expound upon that concert for a good long time, but I'll save that for another time. But make a long story short, at the end of our conversation, he said, "You come to Memphis and you have a home as long as I got mine." And so by let's see, I guess it was the spring of '74 that I went to Memphis, and it took me about a week to find both of them, but because Booker White had also, as I mentioned, invited me to spend some time with them. So it took me about a week to find both of them, and once I did, it was only about 2 blocks. They only lived about 2 blocks away from each other.
Wow.
And yeah, and so I wound up meeting a young blues player named Tony Beiserdorf that was only living about 3 or 4 blocks away from there, and he invited me to park my little old milk truck that I was living in, milk truck blues, and it was turquoise color, 59 Chevy step van that Booker White nicknamed Old Blue.
Nice.
And anyhow, so I would spend my days mostly visiting either Furry or Booker, or usually both in the same day. But I had to be careful because even though they only lived about 2 blocks from each other, they had quite a feud going on between the two of them. So I had to kind of mind my P's and Q's about where I was going and who I was spending the most time with.
Understood. Now, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that you did your first blues in a school at the age of 19, and you said that you realized or figured out that it needed to it was important to not just share the music, but African American history. Now, you're talking about, this has to be about 69, 70, right?
Yeah. Actually, I think by the time I did that school, it was probably about springtime of 71. That was my first public school, but before that, I had already done a lot of like private teaching. But those were mostly like guitar classes. But then I started doing ensembles too, ensemble classes where I would teach about the importance of going beyond just the notes of the blues scale and going beyond treating blues like learning it in the same realm that a top 40 band would cover and do note-for-note replications, et cetera, and started to try to impart a little bit of the education of putting the blues in the context of Black history and Black culture, opposed to just a microcosm.
Okay, now I'm happy you cleared that up. Well, not cleared that up, but explained that in detail because there came a time, based on our conversations off air, the work I know that you've done, and so many of my peers and friends, that we all celebrate the work you've done throughout the years. Now, one of my favorite movies is Remember the Titans, right? Now, I believe this was in 72. What was it, 72 or 74? This took place. So, those who know this movie is about an area, I think, of Virginia that was still segregated, heavily segregated, and there was a lot of issues. And this high school hired a Black coach to try to resolve some segregation issues, and it spilled into the team, and different things took place. Now, I bring this up because in 1974, America was still heavily segregated, which most people don't want to acknowledge. I don't think people don't know. I'll just say acknowledge. Now, I agree. I bring this up because at some point, as you evolved as a music teacher and a history teacher, my question is two points. What triggered during that time to make you say, I have to explain to people the connection of this music in African American history? And part two of that is, did you face any resistance?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You said...
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, I did. Yeah, that deserves a good long before I answer. Yeah, there was definitely resistance then. There's still resistance now. Our country was segregated in '74, and it's 2017, and new Jim Crow is alive and sick as ever, and still separating and segregating people, and the hands of the Father Time are moving counterclockwise. So right away, I pretty much met resistance, even during the very first school program that I did when I was 19, when I really started explaining to kids that, like myself, when I was 11 years old and exposed to the Beatles, I thought that this was a brand new musical form, a brand new innovation that, it might have been rooted somewhat in Elvis Presley, but I had no idea that at 11 years old, growing up in that area, that it was really Black music in whiteface,
Wow.
And that and the irony of that America had to be turned on to its own heritage of Black originated blues music and R&B and Motown by a young, barely out of high school British groups that had to be brought overseas, and where they could be on primetime television on Sunday's most highly rated, popular television show, the Ed Sullivan Show. Though more smooth artists like Motown artists or crossover artists like Sammy Davis Jr. Could perform on that program. The raw, in your face blues of Howlin' Wolf or Sonny Boy Williamson or Muddy Waters wouldn't be allowed, but the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or the Yardbirds, and week after week, it was for at least a couple of years. It was just like one band after another. The Beatles opened up a floodgate, which is known as the British Invasion, and almost all those bands, not only were they rooted in blues, but oftentimes they had accompanied blues musicians like Sonny Boy or John Lee Hooker, et cetera, et cetera. Little Richard, the Beatles backed up Little Richard. And, supposedly they even got their, one theory was they even got their hairstyle from Little Richard, because when he would be doing as well as their, wow. That when Little Richard started shaking it up and shaking it on down, that his hair also got on down with him. So the pompadour would flip into the long, bangs. And
so he sweated his hair out.
Yeah. Or as Little Richard said, that's not sweat, that's holy water. But anyhow, it was clear to me. But it took a few years for me to realize that this music was rooted in black music. Fortunately, I was really drawn to more or less beatnik culture. Hippie culture hadn't really developed yet, but I was kind of drawn to beatnik culture, and I would hang out in little university coffee houses at like 15 years of age, and was exposed to a lot of older musicians, jazz musicians, blues musicians, beats in general, poets, and existentialists, intellectuals, and they set me straight, and nothing buttered up. It just looked straight up that this was black music, and that don't waste your time listening to the imitation when you could be hearing the real thing. And I'll admit that at first it was some of the music was like because I had been grown up in such a homogenized way that some of the music was like at first like too raw. And I liked the Beatles and the Rolling Stones versions better, but it didn't take long. By the time I was 16, then and a hitchhiking trip down to Berkeley, California, where I was staying with some much older friends. One was a university professor at Berkeley, and him and his friend took me to, and my buddy, my hitchhiking companion, took us to the New Orleans house in Berkeley, California, where I saw Buddy Guy. I hadn't even heard of Buddy Guy before. That was like spring, by then, and that was spring of 1968. And I was just like totally blown away. And then next night I saw Richie Havens and Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company for about a 5-hour show at the Fillmore. And so between seeing those three artists, it just like totally changed my outlook, and I was kind of, it was, in a way, it was kind of my baptism, because I really lost interest in basically all forms of music outside of blues and blues related music, basically for the rest of my life.
Wow, I can hear that. Now, so let me ask you this question, okay?
Sure.
Because you stand on the principles that a lot of historians and enthusiasts share blues history in alignment with African American history based on, I guess, their either purpose or agenda, right? And that there's a lot of truths that are either left out or distorted. Now,
yep.
Knowing that, right, so now knowing that there is a large percentage of white folk, not just musicians, right, and not just musicians, but just white people who not only know this, but and accept it, but share it, believe it, and respect it, and work to share the, I guess, the real story of it. Why does it still seem that there's this distorted version of the story, or why is there so much pushback to the actual history and heritage rather than those of historians and enthusiasts that wish to tell their version of the story?
Right. Well, first of all, I need to relate it to a couple of things that are happening nationalistically right now. The NFL football players, or or the Harvey Weinstein thing, for that matter. Wow. People are asking, why didn't people speak out? Why are people being punished for speaking out? And both of the so people are asking why they're asking why are people speaking out in the NFL situation, and then in the Harvey Weinstein situation, people are kind of blaming the victims, saying, "Oh, why didn't they speak out before?" Well, the answer to both is repression and lack of freedom of speech, and the repercussions for speaking out. I didn't catch it, but you said that you opened up with a Mississippi John Hurt song. Okay, yeah. Well, when Mississippi John Hurt was so-called, quote-unquote, rediscovered by John Fahey and Ed Denson, and that trip that was inspired from listening to his old 78 recording that he recorded in his early 20s of his song Avalon, talking about his hometown and little white spot in the road in Mississippi. And they went down there just on, I mean, God bless them for doing that. They went all the way down there to see just the off chance that this guy was still alive and somehow still connected to this little town. And sure enough, like that, the one of the first persons they saw was this old black man, and I think on a tractor, and they stopped and asked him if John Hurt was still around, and he thought they were either, that he had maybe somehow unknowns to him broken some kind of Jim Crow rule, and these guys might be KKK or whatever, or maybe even worse, these guys were Northern civil rights white what activists, but what white Southerners mostly were calling Northern agitators.
Right, right.
And they, oh man, here they come. They want me to try to go register to vote. They say they're going to help me do this. Well, I don't want to talk to either the Klan or them white activists. I don't want to talk to either one of them, because if I go to register to vote, man, that could get me in a lot of trouble. And so,
right.
I mean, yeah. I mean, they could lose their jobs. Their wives could lose their jobs. They could have a cross burned in their yard, or much worse. You know, so so this repression using, So what did Donald Trump do the other day? He said, "Well, if the NFL chiefs and presidents and CEOs or whatever don't get down on these athletes and get them off their knees, that I'm gonna make sure that we're going to take another look at all these huge tax breaks that we've been giving the NFL." Right? And then in the case of Harvey Weinstein, people are complaining, blaming victims. Well, why didn't they speak up sooner? Once again, it's the same thing. They didn't speak up because they knew the repercussions could cost them their career.
Wow.
So this is why it's important to have a total disregard for your career, basically, in life. And my career never went anywhere anyhow, so I just don't give a crap. I made musical decisions that left me out in the cold in a lot of ways. These hard rock blues clubs, passing themselves off as blues clubs, would say I was too jazzy for them, or I played too many slow blues, or I'd break out my acoustic guitar, and that didn't play with them. Or if I went into a jazz club, they would say, even after doing a whole night of bebop and swing, they would go, "Well, that was really good, but you really belong in a blues club." So, I never hesitated to switch and commercialize my calling musically or politically. It's just like you either hear the calling or you do it, and you figure out that's what you were sent here for, or you compromise and lose everything else. So that's why I'm saying my career.
I totally understand.
I'm somewhat talented. I could have gone probably a little farther than I did it if I had made some of those compromises. But and my even with my as far as my blues and school career too, I've definitely I've taken more hits than I could ever recall because of the nature of the program. But you know what? One door closes. As long as your foot, another one opens. As long as your foot's not stuck in it.
Well, let me before we wrap up. Let me ask you this one last question. You kind of answered already, but I wanted you to give a little bit more detail, especially based on discussing what John Hurt may have thought and how Southern whiteys considered Northern white folk northern agitators, right?
Exactly. Right.
Now, because this is, a lot of people don't understand the dynamics of the South. It's not just I don't. It wasn't just a disdain or a stay in your place to black folk, but it was outsiders. Don't come here with your.
Oh yeah.
I have to say it harshly, nigga loving ways.
Exactly.
Okay? So now, with that being said, you as a white brother, were you looked at based on your work as a northern agitator when you would travel and preach your gospel?
Mostly.
Wow.
Even among a lot of our Blue Society people.
Wow.
Let's just call it straight. I've never so much worried. The KKK never stopped me from doing anything as much as Blue Society members that felt uncomfortable for me telling it like it is, telling it like it was, and with hopes that by telling it that way, that it would change the present and hopefully the future. And those that were uncomfortable with that, of course, they wouldn't be. I'd rather deal with a Klansman because a Klansman will tell you where he's at. He won't.
Absolutely.
He'll stab you directly and give you a chance to defend yourself, opposed to stabbing you in the back.
Wow. Brother, it's been wonderful, and you're going to come back on here because we got to finish this conversation.
Anytime.
And many more.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so glad to see you on the air. And just as far as you're a good example of one door closes, another one, and hopefully many, many, many more will be opening up for you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you for your work.
Take care.